The North Korean human rights issue first came up in the United Nations in 2003. Before that, even though there have been NGO reports, such as one from Amnesty International, that there were prisoners camps, there were torture, there were some serious human rights violations in North Korea in the 1980s, 1990s. But those claims by non-governmental organizations were not confirmed because the information coming out from North Korea was very limited until the mid-1990s, when the North Korean defectors started to come out from North Korea. Defectors since mid-1990s came out of North Korea every year. Every year, more than 1,000 defectors came out. So they made their testimony, and many of them testified on human rights violations in North Korea. That's how the United Nations picked up this issue in 2003, first in the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and 2 years later in the UN General Assembly in New York. And in 2004, the United Nations appointed a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the DPRK. In 2014, even though the North Korean human rights issue had been dealt with in the UN every year, in 2014 there was a new special momentum, which was called the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the DPRK. This commission was headed by a gentleman named Michael Kirby, who was former Supreme Court Justice of Australia. He and two other members of the commission investigated on the North Korean human rights situation because they were not able to enter North Korea for that purpose. They interviewed more than 200 North Korean defectors, both in South Korea and in America. As a result, they came up with 400-page reports on North Korean human rights situation. And this report was submitted to the UN General Assembly, first to the UN Human Rights Council and then UN General Assembly in early 2014. The importance of this report was that it was the first international report to describe the human rights situation in North Korea as crimes against humanity. Is not a rhetoric, it is a legal charge that qualifies for referral to International Criminal Court and also for the exercise of responsibility to protect, or R2P. The UN General Assembly, after discussing this report in 2014, adopted a resolution to encourage Security Council to consider COI recommendations, including the Council's debate on DPRK human rights situation and referral of the North Korean case to ICC. In addition to ICC referral, the Commission of Inquiry report made recommendations to North Korea itself. It urged North Korea to undertake political and institutional reforms to introduce check and balances upon the powers of the Supreme Leader and the Workers' Party of Korea. It also recommended North Korea to acknowledge the existence of human rights violations, dismantle all political prison camps, and to release all political prisoners. And it also finally recommended North Korean government to accept a field-based presence and technical assistance from the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and other UN entities to help to implement the above-mentioned recommendations. As a result, in December 2014, the Security Council decided to add the situation of the DPRK to its agenda following a procedural vote. The Council held its first ever discussion on the human rights situation in the DPRK on December 22nd, 2014. I was Korean ambassador to the United Nations that time, and that was my last duty as a member of the Security Council, because at the end of that year, South Korea's term on the Security Council was expiring. So the meeting where they discussed North Korean human rights situation for the first time in history was my last meeting as a member of the Security Council of that year. After that meeting, the Security Council is discussing North Korean human rights issue every year, usually in December. So in 2015, 16, and 17, and probably this year, in coming months as well, the Security Council is dealing with the North Korean human rights issue. Security Council is not taking any action on this issue because it is not easy to get consensus among permanent members to take action on such an issue. Even so, the fact that Security Council is dealing with North Korean human rights issue is important because there are only a few cases that have been discussed at the Security Council when it comes to human rights issues. And then finally, I would like to invite you to consider what should be done at this stage when it comes to the North Korean human rights issue. At this stage, I mean when we are improving ties with North Korea, when South Korea is improving bilateral ties with North Korea. And a lot of people are making efforts with the expectation of the lifting of sanctions after the North Korean nuclear issue is resolved. So with the process of denuclearization, if that happens, the sanctions imposed on North Korea will be either eased or eventually be lifted. In which case, there will be more opportunities for the two Koreas to work together, not only in terms of exchange of people, exchange of sports and arts, but also in terms of more substantive economic collaboration. If we have that kind of expectation for the future, how do we deal with North Korean human rights issue? Well, rapprochement or improvement of ties in the Korean Peninsula does not necessarily mean that the human rights situation in North Korea will get better. We continue to need to make efforts for the improvement of the human rights situation in North Korea. That's for sure. But at the same time, when we are dealing with the North Korean government more directly and we are working with North Korean government, it is not easy to bring up the human rights issue, because human rights issue naturally has a lot to do with governance. If you have democratic governance, it is obviously be more likely that you will have fewer human rights issues. But if one just insists that, some country should go democratic to resolve all the human rights issues, that might make some sense, but not very realistic. Waiting for democratization and doing nothing to improve human rights is not ideal. So we need to make efforts, even though democratization is delayed, there are things we can do to improve human rights. So I'd like to suggest 3 approaches for North Korean human rights issue in the kind of age of rapprochement on the Korean Peninsula. First, I like to suggest technical, non-political approach, which means we don't have to sound like we are trying to bash the current North Korean government because it is not democratic. It is not democratic, we admit it, but while even before realizing full democracy, there are things the North Korean government can do to improve human rights in North Korea. And we can always help. One good example can be found in the area of rights of persons with disabilities. The way I see it, all the positive developments in the rights of persons with disabilities in North Korea have taken place during the last 7 years, which means during Chairman Kim Jong-un's rule. North Korea joined CRPD, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. North Korea started to participate in Paralympics, both summer and winter, all during the last 7 years. Likewise, we can encourage North Korea to do the same things in other areas of human rights, even if progress in political human rights, political freedoms might be slower than other areas, we can still make progress. We can still push for improved human rights in other areas. The second approach I would like to suggest is institutional approach. Institutional approach means we are not raising human rights issues for any political reasons, for any other purposes, but as an institution, South Korean government and South Korean law and South Korean legislation require that we promote human rights vis-a-vis North Korea. And North Korea should understand this. So that's the institutional approach. And third approach I would like to suggest is a non-governmental, civil society approach, meaning when there are things government find difficult to raise with North Korea. In South Korea, we have many hardworking civil society organizations. They can always raise these human rights issues. They can always make efforts to promote human rights in North Korea. In the meantime, the efforts continue to restore trust and national identity between the two Koreas through exchange of people, exchange of sports and arts, exchange of a lot of other areas that can take place even while the sanctions are going on, sanctions are imposed, there are still things we can do between the two Koreas, but of course there will be a lot more possibility and potential for the two Koreas to work with when the denuclearization of North Korea is completed and when the sanctions are lifted. So until then, we continue our efforts. Thank you.